I'm Brandon Whitaker. I'm 42 years old, and I own a mid-sized restoration company here in Knoxville, Tennessee, the kind of company that gets called in after everyone else has already made a mess of things. And I built my entire reputation on doing the job the right way, which in my industry means tearing out what's rotten instead of slapping drywall over mold, replacing compromised beams instead of sistering them with cheap lumber, and hoping no one looks too closely. And I've always believed that if something is cracked beneath the surface, you expose it, you deal with it, and you fix it properly, because covering it up only guarantees a bigger collapse later. That mindset has followed me home more often than I care to admit. And lately I've been feeling like something structural inside my own marriage has been shifting in a way I can't quite measure, like a hairline fracture spreading quietly behind fresh paint. My wife, Lauren Whitaker, is 35, sharp, organized, and usually the most grounded person in any room. But for the past few months, there's been this strange tension hanging between us. Not loud arguments or slammed doors, just a constant low-pressure system that never fully clears, like humidity before a storm. Earlier this week, she kept mentioning this upscale bistro in Market Square, the kind of place with dim lighting, craft cocktails, and a waiting list on weekends, and she brought it up enough times that I decided to make a Friday night reservation, thinking maybe if I handled something without being asked, if I showed up present and intentional instead of distracted and tired, it might reset whatever has been quietly drifting out of alignment between us. I finished up a commercial renovation that afternoon, a water damage restoration in an old brick building downtown, where the previous contractor had tried to seal and soaked insulation instead of replacing it, and I stayed later than usual to make sure the new subfloor was level and the moisture readings were clean, because I refused to leave a job half done. And then I drove home, showered off the dust and the faint smell of treated lumber, put on the navy blazer Lauren bought me last Christmas, and headed to Market Square early. I arrived nearly 30 minutes before our reservation because I hate being rushed, and because I wanted a moment to sit with my thoughts before she got there. And as I walked across the square, the evening air felt cool and steady, the brick under my shoes familiar, the soft glow from storefront windows reflecting off polished glass. And I kept telling myself that this was just dinner, that married couples have phases, that not every quiet stretch means something is broken beyond repair. Inside the bistro, the lighting was low and warm, amber tones bouncing off dark-wood tables and brushed brass fixtures. And the hostess greeted me with a professional smile before leading me to a corner table near the window, the kind of table that feels private without being hidden. And I sat down, folded my hands, and noticed how tight my shoulders were, even though there was no reason for them to be. As I waited, I thought about the past few months in small, specific fragments. Lauren turning her phone face down more often than she used to, conversations that used to stretch comfortably, now ending in clipped sentences. Her laughter feeling slightly delayed, like she was performing it instead of falling into it. And I kept trying to rationalize it the way I rationalize structural stress in a building, telling myself that what expands and contracts, that foundations settle, that not every shift means collapse. The waiter came by to offer water, and I ordered a bourbon neat to steady myself, watching the ice and neighboring glasses clink softly as other couples leaned in toward each other, their heads close, their body language open. And I told myself that tonight I would be present. I would listen instead of defend. I would treat whatever this tension is the same way I treat a damaged support beam, with patience, honesty, and the willingness to tear out whatever is compromised instead of pretending it can hold weight forever. Lauren arrived 10 minutes after our reservation time, and the moment she stepped through the glass doors, every head near the entrance seemed to shift in her direction, because she looked flawless in a way that felt almost deliberate. Her dark hair styled in loose waves that framed her face perfectly, her makeup precise but not heavy, her black dress tailored enough to catch the warm restaurant lighting along the curve of her shoulders. And she moved with an energy that didn't match the quiet tension we had been carrying at home, an energy that felt bright and outward instead of turned toward me. When she reached the table, she leaned down to kiss my cheek, her perfume light and sharp, and for a brief second I felt something settle in my chest, because she looked happy, genuinely energized, like the version of her I used to see at parties or charity events when she was completely in her element. But that moment barely had time to register before her eyes shifted past me toward the bar, her posture straightening, her expression sharpening with recognition. She said a name under her breath, a man she had mentioned once or twice after a networking event earlier in the year, someone involved in regional development or consulting, and before I could fully process it, her entire body angled subtly away from me and toward him. Not enough to seem rude at first glance, but enough that I felt the physical shift like a draft of cold air across my neck. Within seconds, he noticed her too and smiled in that practiced way men in tailored jackets do. And Lauren's laugh came out louder than I had heard it in months, a bright, ringing sound that carried across the tables and made a couple at the next booth glance over before quickly pretending they hadn't. And she stood halfway from her seat as he approached, greeting him with an enthusiasm that felt almost rehearsed. I tried to stay present, to remain steady, introducing myself when he reached the table, extending my hand and stating my name clearly. But Lauren was already leaning toward him, asking about his recent trip to San Diego that he had apparently posted about online, her voice animated, her questions rapid, her eyes locked onto his face with a focus I had not felt directed at me in weeks. He launched into stories about oceanfront meetings, rooftop dinners, and spontaneous weekend drives along the coast. And Lauren laughed again, tipping her head back slightly, her hand brushing the edge of the table near his arm, as if proximity itself energized her. And I found myself attempting to interject, to comment on the development project happening locally, to steer the conversation back toward something we could share, but my words slid off the surface unnoticed. Her menu remained closed in front of her, untouched, while I had already scanned the entrees twice waiting for her attention to return, and the waiter hovered nearby, with that tight professional smile servers where when they sense discomfort but cannot acknowledge it, his pen poised above his notepad as he glanced between the three of us, clearly unsure whether this was a two-person dinner or something shifting into a different dynamic. I tried again to bring Lauren back in a moment by referencing the renovation I had just completed downtown, thinking perhaps a local project might anchor her attention, but she nodded absently, without breaking eye contact with him. Her response is short and distracted, and then immediately pivoted back to asking him about the boutique hotels he had visited in California. The longer it went on, the more I felt myself receding into the background of my own reservation, sitting at a table I had booked, wearing a jacket she had bought me, watching my wife give someone else the kind of focused engagement that used to be reserved for us when we were still discovering each other's stories. I became acutely aware of the surrounding couples, the subtle sideways glances, the way one woman across the aisle nudged her partner gently, as if to signal that something was off, and the waiter finally cleared his throat softly to ask if we were ready to order drinks, his voice slightly strained from standing there too long. Lauren barely looked at the menu before ordering her usual cocktail from memory, her tone bright and effortless, and then immediately resumed the conversation about coastal sunsets and startup conferences, leaving her plate of bread untouched, and her husband, sitting inches away, feeling like background noise in a room that was suddenly far too well lit. I kept my tone steady because that is what I have trained myself to do in rooms where tension starts to rise. The same way, I keep my voice level when a client realizes the damage to their building is worse than they thought, and I leaned back slightly in my chair and asked about the wine list as if nothing unusual was happening, asking Lauren whether she still preferred the Sonoma Pinot she used to order on special occasions, asking Derek Lawson, 38, according to what Lauren had once mentioned, if he had any recommendations since he clearly traveled enough to have opinions about vineyards and pairings, and I made sure my posture remained open and relaxed, even though there was a tightening behind my ribs that felt like a beam beginning to splinter under hidden weight. Derek, to his credit, did not lean into the dynamic the way Lauren did, and I could see the faint discomfort in the way he shifted his stance, one hand in his jacket pocket, the other resting lightly against the back of the empty bar stool beside him, as though he were physically bracing himself not to cross a line he could sense without anyone explicitly naming it. And when I included him in the conversation, he responded politely but briefly, deflecting attention back toward us whenever possible, making small comments about Knoxville's growth, about the difference between West Coast and Southern markets, never once inserting himself in a way that would feel territorial or intrusive. I asked Lauren about our weekend plans, referencing the hardware order I needed to finalize on Saturday morning and the idea we had floated about driving out to Norris Lake on Sunday, and she nodded without really hearing me, her eyes flickering between Derek's face and the soft glow of her phone whenever it lit up on the table beside her plate. And each time the screen brightened, she flipped it face down with a speed that was too smooth to be accidental, her fingers practiced, almost automatic. At first I told myself it was coincidence, that everyone guards their notifications in public spaces, but then it happened again, and instead of simply turning the phone over, she slid it slightly under her folded napkin, tucking the corner of white linen over the edge of the device in a way that blocked the screen from view while still keeping it within reach. And the movement was so fluid that it carried the unmistakable feel of repetition, of something done many times before. While Derek described a recent conference panel in San Diego, mentioning oceanfront venues and venture capital mixers, my mind drifted not to California, but to our kitchen counter at home, to nights when Lauren would sit at the island long after I'd gone to bed, the blue glow of her screen lighting up the darkened room, to the way she had changed her phone password 3 months ago and laughed it off as a security update when I asked about it, to the subtle shift in how she angled her screen away from me whenever I walked into the room unexpectedly. I remembered the late-night scrolling, the slight smile she would suppress when she thought I wasn't looking, the way conversations between us had grown shorter, while her online presence seemed to grow more animated. And as I watch her now, fully engaged with Derek's travel stories, flipping her phone face down the instant it illuminated, sliding it beneath linen as if shielding something fragile or secret, the separate pieces began, aligning with a clarity that left no room for denial. I kept speaking calmly, commenting on the Cabernet selection, thanking Derek for stopping by, even suggesting that if he ever needed restoration work on any of the older commercial properties downtown, he could reach out, because professionalism is reflex for me, and I would not be the man who loses composure in a public dining room. But inside I was cataloging every movement, every practiced gesture, every tiny withdrawal that had defined the past few months. The waiter finally poured the wine, and as Lauren lifted her glass, she smiled at Derek in a way that was bright but edged, and I noticed she did not once reach for my hand or glance toward me with that silent partnership we used to share in crowded spaces. And in that quiet, controlled moment, I understood that what I had been sensing was not random stress or seasonal distance, but a pattern, deliberate and sustained, like structural damage concealed behind freshly painted walls, undeniable ones. You know exactly where to look. I let the conversation stretch a few seconds longer than it needed to, watching the way Lauren's attention lingered anywhere but on me, feeling the weight of the room press inward as Derek finally excused himself with a polite nod and retreated back to the bar, clearly unwilling to stand in the center of whatever was forming between us. And when he stepped away, the absence of his presence felt louder than his conversation had been. The wine sat untouched in my glass as I looked directly at Lauren, not at her dress or her perfectly styled hair, but at her face, at the subtle curve of her mouth that still carried the echo of her laughter from moments earlier. And I spoke evenly, quietly, asking her if she was actually here with me tonight, not in the physical sense because that was obvious, but in the way two people sit across from each other, intending to share a moment rather than divide it. She didn't flinch at the question, didn't look surprised or defensive, and that calmness unsettled me more than anger would have, because she slowly tilted her head to the side in that deliberate way she does when she believes she holds the upper hand in a conversation, and a faint smirk touched the corner of her lips, as if she were indulging a child who had just misunderstood something simple. She told me to relax, drawing the word out softly, her tone light but edged, and it was not reassurance, it was not warmth. It carried the subtle vibration of a challenge, like she was daring me to escalate, daring me to lose the composure I had maintained all evening. And the way she leaned back in her chair made it clear she felt entirely in control of the situation unfolding in front of us. I kept my posture straight and my voice low, telling her that I was relaxed, but that I was also aware of what had just happened, aware of how she had engaged with him, aware of how she had ignored me. And even as I spoke, I could sense the air around our table changing, the soft murmur of surrounding conversations dipping just slightly as nearby diners registered the shift in tone. Lauren let out a small breath that could have been a laugh if there had been any warmth in it, and she lifted her glass, taking a slow sip before setting it down with precise care. Her eyes locked onto mine without blinking, and then she said that if I did not like it, the door was open, delivering the line casually, almost lazily, as though she were commenting on the weather rather than issuing a dismissal. There was no raised voice, no dramatic gesture, just calm cruelty wrapped in composure, and the simplicity of it hit harder than any shouted accusation could have, because it meant she had already considered the possibility of me leaving, already positioned herself emotionally beyond the need to persuade or soothe. The surrounding tables had grown quiet enough that I could hear the faint clink of cutlery from the far side of the room and the soft hum of the overhead lights, and I felt the humiliation settle not as a sharp stab, but as a heavy weight pressing downward through my chest, a slow, undeniable realization that whatever foundation we once stood on was no longer level. I noticed the couple to our left suddenly engrossed in their menus, their shoulders angled deliberately away from us, and the waiter hesitating near the service station, pretending to polish a glass while clearly aware that something had shifted, and I remained still, hands folded loosely on the table, refusing to let my face betray the impact of her words even as they echoed in the space between us. In that moment, I understood that this was not a misunderstanding or a temporary mood, not stress or distraction, but a deliberate test of boundaries delivered in public view. And as I held her gaze without raising my voice or breaking eye contact, I felt the final illusion of stability crack cleanly down the center, quiet but irreversible. I did not raise my voice and I did not slam my hand against the table, because on job sites when I pulled back a sheet of drywall and find rods spreading through studs that looked perfectly sound from the outside, I do not panic or curse or start swinging a hammer blindly. I go quiet and precise. I assess the damage. I trace where it began, and I speak in measured terms about what needs to be removed and what can still be saved. And that same stillness settled over me now as I looked at the woman. I had been married to for 7 years. I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate and leaned forward just slightly, keeping my tone even and controlled as I told her that I came here tonight for a date with my wife, not to sit across from her while she entertained another man, as if I were incidental to the evening. And there was no accusation in my volume, no theatrical anger, just a clear statement of fact delivered the way I would explain a structural report to a client who needed to hear the truth without drama. Lauren's expression shifted, but not into guilt or reflection. Instead, her eyes hardened with something that looked almost amused, and she shook her head once, as if dismissing an exaggeration, telling me that I was being insecure and dramatic, that I was reading too much into a harmless conversation. And the words were smooth and rehearsed, like she had already anticipated this exact exchange and prepared her response in advance. I told her that insecurity has nothing to do with expecting basic respect at your own dinner table, and that dramatic implies something exaggerated, when in reality, I was responding to what had unfolded directly in front of me. And even as I spoke, I felt a strange detachment of someone documenting damage rather than living inside it. She rolled her eyes slightly, not enough for the whole room to notice, but enough for me to see the disdain in it. And then she leaned back in her chair again, crossing her legs slowly, reclaiming physical space, as if to emphasize that she felt no pressure to adjust her behavior. And in that small gesture, I understood how far apart we had drifted without me fully acknowledging it. The waiter approached cautiously, his movements tentative, clearly aware of the tension, but unwilling to acknowledge it verbally. And before I could say anything about ordering, or even suggest we finish the meal with some semblance of normalcy, Lauren turned to him with a calm, controlled smile, and asked him to split the check. She said it casually, almost pleasantly, as though it were the most reasonable request in the world. And in that moment, the weight of it landed heavier than any insult she had thrown at me, because splitting the check was not about money. It was about redefining the entire frame of the evening, about reducing a 7-year marriage to 2 separate transactions settled at the end of a meal. I watched the waiter hesitate for a fraction of a second before nodding and retreating, and the sound of nearby silverware resumed faintly as conversations at surrounding tables slowly picked back up, but the air around us felt altered, thinner somehow, as if oxygen had been pulled from the room. Lauren reached for her phone again, glancing at it briefly before placing it face down beside her empty glass. And there was no tremor in her hands, no sign that she considered this moment significant. While I sat there feeling the final layer of denial peel away cleanly, I realized then that I was not witnessing a temporary lapse or a bad mood, but a deliberate repositioning, a recalibration of power and distance. And I remained composed not because I was unaffected, but because control is the only thing left when something foundational gives way. And as I looked at the woman across from me, I understood with precise clarity that whatever had once held us together was no longer load-bearing. I did not argue further, and I did not attempt to salvage the evening with forced civility, because there comes a point in any negotiation, whether over a damaged foundation or a failing relationship, where continuing to press only grinds the fracture deeper. So when the waiter returned with 2 separate receipts, I took mine without comment, reviewed the total out of habit more than concern, signed my name in the same steady handwriting I use on contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, left a proper tip because the staff had done nothing to deserve discomfort, and stood from the table without theatrics, without slamming a chair or making a scene. Lauren did not try to stop me, and she did not apologize. And the only sound between us as I walked away was the faint scrape of my chair legs against the polished floor, and I felt eyes on my back as I crossed the restaurant. But I kept my shoulders square and my pace even, stepping out into the cooler air of Market Square, where the noise of the evening crowd swallowed whatever humiliation might have lingered inside. I did not wait for her. I did not look back through the glass to see what she was doing, because the clarity that had settled over me left no room for dramatic exits or final glances. And I walked to my truck, unlocked it, and sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine, letting the quiet hum fill the cab as I adjusted the rearview mirror out of pure reflex. The drive home felt longer than it should have, even though traffic was light, the streetlights passing in steady intervals across the windshield. And about 5 minutes into the drive, my phone lit up in the cup holder with her name on the screen, the first message appearing before I even reached the interstate ramp. She texted that I made the night awkward, that I overreacted to nothing, that a normal husband would chill and not turn a casual conversation into a scene. And as each message came through in quick succession, the tone sharpened, shifting from irritation to accusation, telling me that I embarrassed her in front of someone important, that I projected insecurity instead of confidence, that I could have just relaxed and let her talk. I read the messages at a red light and felt no surge of anger, only a steady recognition of the pattern I had seen unfold for months, the reframing of boundaries into flaws, the subtle rewriting of events, so that my response became the problem rather than the behavior that prompted it. And I understood that if I engaged in this exchange, it would spiral into the same circular argument we had repeated before, where I explained and she dismissed, where I clarified and she minimized. I typed one message back while parked at another light, keeping it short and exact, telling her that expecting respect from your wife is not insecurity, and that there is a difference between confidence and tolerance for disrespect. And after sending it, I placed the phone face down in the cup holder and did not respond again. The silence that followed was deliberate and controlled. Not passive aggression, but refusal, because I was done participating in arguments where my boundaries were dissected like character defects, where my discomfort was labeled dramatic and my expectations were called outdated. And as I drove the remaining miles home, the road felt steady beneath the tires in a way my marriage no longer did. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat for a moment in the darkened cab, engine idling softly, and I knew that tonight was not about a single dinner or a man at a bar or even a split check. It was about the quiet realization that I would no longer negotiate for basic respect, and the decision to go silent was not avoidance, but the first controlled move I had made all evening. I woke before dawn without the need for an alarm, the house still and heavy with the kind of silence that follows a fracture you can no longer pretend is superficial, and I lay there for a few seconds staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the distant rush of an early truck on the main road, feeling not anger or panic but a cold, deliberate clarity settle into place. I rolled out of bed, quietly, and did not look toward Lauren's side of the room, because whatever expression might have been there was no longer relevant to the decision forming in my chest, and I moved with the same efficiency I bring to a job site when a structure has to be secured before more damage spreads, pulling a duffel bag from the closet and placing it on the bed, selecting only what I needed rather than everything I could carry. I packed clothes for a week, durable and practical, jeans, work shirts, a couple of button-downs, socks folded tightly, shaving kit zipped shut, phone charger wrapped carefully, and then I walked to my office and unlocked the file cabinet where I keep personal and business documents, removing copies of our marriage certificate, the deed to the house, business registration papers, tax returns, insurance policies, and placing them in a slim waterproof folder that fit cleanly into the duffel, without bulging. I opened my laptop at the kitchen island while the sky outside the windows remained dark blue, logging into the business banking portal, and I redirected incoming payments from restoration contracts to a separate account I had quietly maintained for contingency purposes over the years, not out of secrecy, but out of discipline. Because in construction, you always prepare for collapse, even when you hope it never comes. And I updated the authorized contacts on our insurance policies, removing shared access where necessary and listing my attorney as primary for business matters. There was no rush in my movements and no shaking in my hands. Only steady action layered one step after another. And once the financial adjustments were confirmed, I booked a short-term rental in Chattanooga, a small furnished place near the river that offered a month-to-month option, far enough from Knoxville to create distance, but close enough to manage projects without disruption. I then opened a browser tab and scheduled a consultation with a divorce attorney for Monday morning, selecting the earliest available appointment, uploading preliminary documentation, and entering my information with the same precision I use when filing permit applications. Because if something is structurally unsound, you do not wait for it to collapse under additional weight. The horizon had begun to lighten faintly by the time I closed the laptop and zipped the duffel, and I walked through the house one final time, not to reminisce, but to observe, noting the framed photographs on the walls, the dining table where we had once hosted friends, the kitchen counter where I now placed my house key deliberately in the center of the granite surface. I did not write a note, and I did not leave an explanation, because she had already told me the door was open, and I had listened carefully enough to understand that she did not believe I would ever walk through it, and the absence of a note felt more honest than any paragraph I could draft in the early hours. When I stepped outside, the air was cool and quiet, the first birds beginning to stir in the trees lining the street, and I closed the front door gently behind me without hesitation, locking it from the outside out of habit before slipping the key onto the counter through the mail slot, leaving it visible where it could not be misinterpreted. I loaded the duffel into my truck, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb as dawn finally broke over the neighborhood, not in anger and not in defeat, but in decision, because she told me the door was open and I chose to walk through it permanently, not as a threat or a gesture, but as the only remaining structural move left to make. Over the following weeks, the messages began arriving in waves, never steady, never consistent, but always timed just closely enough together to feel intentional. And I watched the pattern unfold from the quiet of a furnished apartment in Chattanooga, where the only sounds at night were distant traffic and the low hum of the HVAC system cycling on and off. At first the text carried guilt, short lines about how the house felt empty without me, about how she could not believe things had escalated so quickly, about how she missed the sound of my truck pulling into the driveway. And I read them without responding, not out of cruelty, but because guilt without ownership is only an attempt to pull someone back into a dynamic that has not actually changed. Then the tone shifted to nostalgia, and she began sending photos from old vacations, sunsets from Gulf shores, a picture of us standing in front of the Smoky Mountains on our 3rd anniversary, a candid shot from a rooftop bar downtown where we had once laughed easily and leaned into each other without tension, and I could see the strategy in it, the attempt to anchor me in memory rather than reality, to remind me of what had been without acknowledging what had deteriorated. When those did not pull a reaction, the accusation surfaced, sharper and more defensive, messages claiming that I could not handle her independence, that I mistook confidence for disrespect, that I had always been uncomfortable with her networking and social presence, reframing my decision to leave as insecurity rather than response. And I recognized the familiar cycle of inversion where my boundaries were repackaged as flaws and my silence was labeled immaturity. I heard through mutual friends that she had begun explaining the situation in selective fragments, emphasizing how abruptly I left, how dramatic the dinner had felt from her perspective, and a few acquaintances reached out cautiously, asking if everything was okay, clearly navigating the version of events they had been given. But I declined to defend myself publicly and allowed my actions to speak in place of arguments, because credibility built over decades does not need loud protection. During that same time, I secured a longer-term furnished apartment, one with a small office space where I could review blueprints and contracts without interruption, and I moved valuables from the Knoxville house into a climate-controlled storage unit, business equipment, personal heirlooms, financial records, anything that required protection while legal processes unfolded. And I handled each task with the same measured discipline I bring to remediation projects, removing what was salvageable and stabilizing what remained. Communication between us narrowed to brief logistical emails regarding utilities, mortgage payments, and shared accounts, each message concise and neutral, stripped of emotional commentary. And I did not engage when she attempted to inject sentiment into those exchanges, responding only to the practical elements that required acknowledgement. Eventually, she sent a longer message claiming she understood what she had done wrong, stating that she realized she had been dismissive and that she had not considered how her words at the restaurant might have landed. But as I read through it, I noticed what was missing. No clear admission of disrespect, no ownership of the months of distance and secrecy, no acknowledgement of the pattern that preceded that night. Only a general expression of regret framed in a way that still centered her feelings rather than the impact of her actions. By then, the clarity that had formed before dawn weeks earlier had only solidified, and I continued forward without announcement or drama, finalizing consultations, organizing documentation, building a life structured on steadiness rather than reaction. And I understood with quiet certainty that when she told me the door was open, she believed it was leverage, a line meant to assert control, never imagining that I would interpret it as permission to leave permanently and mean it.